Now, with the first phase of the High Republic era essentially coming to an end, I thought it was the perfect time to give some overall thoughts on it thus far, to do a video that quickly summarizes what it is and how good or bad it's been in general, without any, or at least too much, spoiler discussion, which is something I'll do in a future video perhaps. I'll probably, in the next few days, do a video where I dig into the story itself more or less. But basically, in this video, I'm going to tell you whether or not I think it's something worth getting into if maybe you're on the fence about reading it or buying some of the books and comics. Not that my opinion should be an end-all, be-all, or deciding factor one way or the other for you, but do know that, like with all things Star Wars, I'm going to be as fair and honest as I possibly can be. I have no sort of agenda here beyond telling you what I actually think about the quality of the story itself, good or bad. I know there are a lot of people out there who just praise all things Star Wars because it's Star Wars without trying to look at it too critically, and I'm sure they're going to tell you the High Republic has been amazing and you need to check it out. As there are also going to be those against the High Republic era because it is seen as a Kathleen Kennedy project and or they just hate Disney and want to see it all fail. They're of course going to tell you how horrible the High Republic is without actually having read a single page of it. And though sure, I can understand both those mindsets. I'm someone who loves Star Wars, but isn't always a huge fan of the way Disney handles it. But I'm still someone who, again, can and will set all that sort of stuff aside and just look at the story in front of me and tell you exactly what I think of it. I can and will remove it from everything else and just judge it as is. And I can say I've now consumed roughly 95% of the High Republic era content that's out there, only missing some of the really younger reader stuff. And so, keeping that in mind, I would say that in many ways the High Republic era, the whole project, if you will, is the exact opposite of the Star Wars sequel trilogy. It even feels like it could have been or was created as a direct response to some of the criticism levied against the sequels. Because whereas there was no real solid plan in place for those films, and where nothing outside of the films really mattered or felt like it was worth reading or was connected to the larger story, I'm talking about the books and comics here, some of which were even called things like Journey to the Force Awakens or Journey to the Rise of Skywalker, yet really had nothing to do with those films. Also, the films themselves were very nostalgia-driven and filled, using, and in some cases you could say abusing, old, well-known characters to tell a story and to lure in an audience, as well as bringing back as much iconic imagery as possible, things like X-Wings, TIE Fighters, another Death Star, and so on. Anyway, whereas the sequel trilogy was all that, the High Republic is a very large-scale, meticulously planned-out story that uses virtually no known or well-known characters, save Master Yoda, who is pretty much only seen in one comic series geared more towards younger readers. It also takes place in a virtually unexplored time period of the Star Wars galaxy, one the expanded universe never really delved into or even touched on, which is the 200-year period before the prequel trilogy. There's also all sorts of new ships, enemies, and so on, and a bunch of new Jedi to get to know, which at first felt like one of the weaker points or aspects of the High Republic for me. It felt like there were so many new Jedi thrown at you right away and all at once, and that they were all so very similar that none of them really stood out. Keeping in mind here that this is supposed to be the height of the Jedi Order, this is the golden age, if you will, and so again at first all the Jedi simply feel too cookie cutter, almost too perfect, if you will, or like they're all the epitome of what a Jedi should be. But I'm happy to say that feeling doesn't last forever. It doesn't last too long or take too long before they really start to differentiate themselves and to all feel like unique characters with their own personalities. In fact, one of the most impressive parts or things about the High Republic is how it portrays the Jedi and the Jedi Order, what they truly should be and how they should operate. It does a really, really good job of this. It shows us that yes, they are guided by compassion and they always strive to do the right thing for others, that they follow the will of the Force above all else, but that they still have feelings that they acknowledge and explore, that they still have friends and all these things that they care about beyond just being a Jedi, that they can separate those things from the duty of being a Jedi. It's of course always Jedi first, but it's not only Jedi. And yes, these Jedi follow and believe in the no attachment rule, but it's not taken 100% literally, as it shouldn't be, and as it wasn't taken literally during the prequel era either. Obi-Wan and Anakin often acknowledge their friendship. Obi-Wan even says he loves Anakin and calls him brother at the very end. They just prioritize and know how to handle their feelings and emotions. That's what Jedi are supposed to do. They don't deny emotions, they learn how to control them, and they learn how to not act based off of just their feelings. Or at least that's how they're supposed to do, and that's how they usually do it. But just like with Anakin in the prequels, as one crisis after another arises, the Jedi of the High Republic era are tested on many levels, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. They have to contend with the full spectrum of feelings, too, from love to hatred, and each one of them handles all these things very differently, which is the best part of the High Republic era. And though, yeah, as I said, it takes a little while to get there, to get really going, and at first you'll be bombarded with all these names of Jedi who all will feel the same, more or less, at the start. When things keep happening, when things keep going wrong for the Jedi and the galaxy and the Republic, when one challenge after another again arises and they start to crack a little, that's when things start to get really good, and I do mean really good. I'd even say the final book in the main series of books, or the adult books, called The Fallen Star, is one of the best Star Wars books I've read in a long time, and one of the best I've ever read. You just have to get there first. You have to go through quite a bit of setup overall in the first 2 books of the series before it feels like things really start to pay off and get really good and interesting. Not that the other 2 books before it were bad or boring by a long shot. The first book in the series, or the adult series of books, called Light of the Jedi, literally starts out with a bang, one that I'll talk more about in the spoiler video. I've talked about it in other videos as well. And it does a really good job of hooking you right out of the gate, and the first half of the book is a real page-turner, but it does slow down a bit after that. And sometimes things in the High Republic era feel like they're almost too planned out, or trying too hard to create and set up this whole time period and all these different characters instead of just focusing on telling one single good story in itself. Which isn't to say I don't enjoy world building. I love world building, or that I don't understand the need for it, especially when you are trying to tell a story in a whole new kind of time period. But here sometimes it feels a bit unnatural. You can tell or sense that this is a collaboration by many different writers and creative minds, instead of one author just giving you their own particular story and telling it in a more natural way. That's the best way I could describe one of the problems with it. It's not really a problem, it's just something you might notice. And speaking of that, of setting up the whole time period and the larger story, and to briefly get back into explaining what this all is exactly if you're still unsure or how it all works, there are several different storylines you can follow that all take place in a different series of books or comics, with them running parallel to each other and crossing over from time to time. What happens in one does affect what happens in the others, but not so drastically that you can't just read your one story and understand what's going on. Though that said, there is pretty much one or perhaps 2 main stories, with the biggest and most important taking place in the adult novels, in the books Light of the Jedi, The Rising Storm, and The Fallen Star. Then there is the Marvel comic series, the mainline comic series called The High Republic, which is also another, again, main story or kind of a core story that goes along with the novels, though it does explore slightly different things. And then there is also other books entirely which are aimed more at the younger audience, a teen audience. There are also some aimed at a much younger audience, a sort of preteen audience. There are also then some other comic book series. There's the one by IDW, which I kind of talked about before, that features Yoda and some younglings. And again, it's aimed at a younger audience. There are also some offshoot comics that are just mini-series that deal with different aspects of the High Republic as well. All in all, a lot of different stories that appeal to different ages that all kind of revolve around the central story told in the main novels. And if you're wondering if you have to read it all to kind of really understand the story to keep up with everything, you don't have to. You can just read those core books and get a good grasp of the whole story. In fact, that really is the whole story. A lot of the other stuff does feel a little more supplementary, which isn't to say big things or important things or cool things and interesting things don't or can't happen in them, or that they're not worth checking out or reading. Basically, they do a really good job of making some of the other stuff not essential, but still relevant and interesting, you could say. Something the rest of the canon books and comics for the other parts of the canon have really failed at or struggled at. They always end up feeling like stories that don't matter, that are neither essential nor relevant to the movies or shows or whatever they are supposed to be attached to. Which is kind of one of the better parts, or one of the best parts of the High Republic era, which is big, important events can happen, things can surprise you, characters will die that you do not expect to die. It makes it much more interesting than trying to read something set between, say, episodes 4 and 5, where you know essentially what has to happen or what can or cannot happen. In other words, even though we know this has to align with what's going to take place in the prequels in 200 years, and in the grand scheme of things, that's not a heck of a lot of time, there is still just enough flexibility to do some, again, surprising things, but maybe not quite as much as they'd have if they would have set this maybe even several hundred years more back, or maybe shortly after the fall of the Sith when Bane started the rule of 2. Which kind of brings up or leads us to one of the bigger issues I do have with the High Republic era, which is that I think the villains could be maybe a little better, a little more interesting. The Nihil have certainly grown on me over time, or as the books and comics have gone on, but I wasn't a huge fan at first. Not that I hated the concept of space Vikings, but they just struck me as very sort of cliche, and the only one who really stands out to me still is their leader. And there's not much more I can go into about them without really kind of going into spoiler territory. But then there's also the Drenger, or the plant monsters, which you may have heard about. And I haven't been impressed with them at all. There's some interesting ideas there, a potentially interesting history that is briefly touched on at a few different points. But let's just say they don't last very long in the story. They feel like some side villains for the comic books before they move into the heart of the story with the Nihil. Okay, and before moving on to my closing thoughts, I will talk briefly about Geode, since I know he has been one of the things many people have criticized about the High Republic, especially those who have not read it. And if you don't know who or what he is, he's basically a character that is a rock, literally a rock, who is a navigator on a ship. And though I personally think it's a pretty dumb idea to include him, not that there couldn't be living rocks in the Star Wars galaxy, I suppose, the whole thing is constantly played as a joke within the story itself. Which, honestly, I don't know if that makes it better or worse that he's in there. No one in story ever actually sees him move or hears him talk, yet it's implied that he does these things somehow. It's not really explained ever just how he moves. It's just kind of assumed that somehow he does, and that the characters who really know him know how he does this, and that the other ones just kind of let it go when they encounter him. As I said, it's played as a joke with so many puns made, it becomes a bit much, even if, yes, you do chuckle at some of them. Either way, I honestly don't know what the point of including him was, other than to just be this weird, kind of strange joke. So in closing here, would I recommend the High Republic era to others? Yeah, I actually would. If you are a fan of Star Wars books and comics, I would recommend checking it out, at least picking up the first book, The Light of the Jedi, and seeing what you think, keeping in mind it does get better over time. And I know some of you have probably heard it's all woke garbage, that it's the brainchild of Kathleen Kennedy and it's terrible, that Geode is the worst character in the history of Star Wars, and I think a debate could be had about that. But most of that is coming from those who, I'm guessing, haven't read any of the books or comics, who didn't give it a chance and just want it to fail. And sure, if you want it to fail without giving it a chance, that's your prerogative. I understand not liking Disney. I get not loving Kathleen Kennedy either. But honestly, if you remove all that from your mind and just take it as it is, it's a pretty good read. No, it's certainly not perfect, and it took me, again, a while to truly warm up to it. And I'd say I didn't really start to appreciate the story till the last book in the adult series of books, or until reading The Fallen Star. But it is getting there. It is shaping up, or rounding out to be, a pretty good and interesting time period and story overall. And in hindsight, I'd say it's certainly been worth the time to read for me. Again, I've read almost everything involved in it. And I am looking forward to more from it, even though, oddly, the next phase of it, or phase 2, is going back another 150 years. Not sure how that's going to play into everything, or the way everything ended, but that is a discussion for the spoiler talk, I suppose. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me if you've read the High Republic era, any of it, or all of it, and what you think of it. And are you interested in checking it out, or do you just have no interest in this whatsoever? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.